There you go. Okay, so it is 7 p.m. and I think we're good to get started, Susan, if you want to start it.
Sure. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody. I am Susan Dove Lemke. I'm the director of the Lincolnwood Library here in Lincolnwood, Illinois, and we are delighted to be hosting the author of the 2024 Lincolnwood Reads selection tonight. But first, let me introduce my colleague, Angie Moreno, who will tell us a little bit about Lincolnwood Reads.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to see a bunch of familiar names here in the attendees. So Lincolnwood Reads every single year. A committee chooses a book that the entire community of Lincolnwood reads, literally Lincolnwood reads, and it takes place in January and February, and we base programs all around the book selection that we do. And obviously this year's choice was The Fun Habit by Mike Rucker, and we did a whole bunch of fun programming around the book. So we had a whole bunch of different programs. We had like self-care for better health and productivity. We had a really fun bad art night for adults. We have our social that's going to happen. Obviously, we're doing our Q&A today, and then we have the collage program that is also coming up. So it's a really fun time for all of our community to come together and read the same book. And then, of course, we have our book discussions that we had a wonderful time meeting and discussing the book. So yeah, that's a little bit about what Lincolnwood Reads is. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
All right. Our Lincolnwood Reads book this year is called The Fun Habit, and I love this subtitle, How the Pursuit of Joy and Wonder Can Change Your Life. Author Mike Rucker is joining us tonight. He is an organizational psychologist and a behavioral scientist with 5 advanced degrees. He has a PhD in organizational psychology from the California School of Professional Psychology and an MBA from the University of Southern California. He is an accredited member of the American College of Sports Medicine, and he calls himself a fitness enthusiast with mechanical parts. He has conducted over 100 interviews with thought leaders, and he has an extensive list of podcast interviews just in the past year. He's obviously a very knowledgeable person, but I must admit that my favorite picture in his book is the one where he is together with Elizabeth Taylor for a brief moment at the Cannes Film Festival. Welcome, Dr. Mike Rucker.
Thank you so much.
And I have a first question for you.
All right.
All right. Do you want to introduce yourself further, or is there anything, did I miss anything?
No, I love it. I think, the mechanical parts is I did get a hip replacement, so we might get into that a little bit later.
Good.
And yeah, I think the only other piece is that's important to my story is I'm a charter member of the International Positive Psychology Association. And for folks that might not know what positive psychology is, around the turn of the millennium, a bunch of academics and practicing clinical psychologists and psychiatrists, quite frankly, got together and started looking at psychological tools for betterment. Up until that point, we had primarily looked at these tools for treating, poor mental outcomes, things that we're familiar with, depression, anxiety, and then a corpus of different researchers realized that it was really brought forth by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Csikszentmihalyi, who studied flow. So most people are familiar with that concept, but also gratitude and mindfulness. We started to really look at these from a research standpoint. And at the beginning, it really was all about happiness. And so part of why the Fun Habit came about is that we realized that maybe we started to overemphasize this idea of happiness as an ideal, and maybe we'll get into that in a little bit. But yeah, I think that's the only thing that's an important sort of bullet to my story.
Absolutely. So can you tell us a little bit about the book for those who might not have gotten a chance to read it yet, but wanted to hear from you?
Yeah, well, great, because that's a great segue into that. So, I've been a zealot of happiness, and for quite some time, now over 20 years. And what had happened in my own life, and what we now know through a whole host of research, is that slowly but surely, as we talked about happiness as an ideal, this idea of being overly concerned of pursuing happiness as an outcome became problematic. So much so that folks that really prescribe to the good vibes only attitude, paradoxically, were some of the most unhappy people. And so I found myself in that spot after a couple things that happened in my life. One of them being my younger brother passing away, and then the mechanical parts. I ended up, I was, an amateur endurance athlete, and used that essentially to mitigate anxiety, and found out that I had an undiagnosed injury and wasn't going to be able to run again. And so within the course of about 12 months, a huge identity change, right? I was, my brother was my only sibling, so now I was an only child, dealing with his grief, but also, what am I going to do with aging parents? And then, this medicine that I had, essentially the ability to run, was taken away from me, and very much was running a part of my identity. It's, where my friends spent their time. And so reconstructing all that. Yet I had this kind of Pollyanna attitude because, I had used all of these tools of positive psychology generally to lift me out of low level malaise, but this wasn't that, right? I mean, losing a sibling is quite traumatic. And the fact that I thought that I could just will myself out of this, again, ultimately led to some really strange outcomes, pretty close to clinical depression. But, I was a researcher at the time. I'd almost finished my dissertation. And so I knew there had to be some answers. Like, okay, great. Um, you know, at the time, there was emerging science. I cite one researcher that I really like in this area, Dr. Iris Mouse out of Cal, who had done some amazing work around that time, 2016, of looking at folks that did kind of ruminate on the fact that they were trying to be happy, but that was always out there in the horizon. And so we knew that through research, again, not looking at happiness as something that we value, right? Like there's nothing wrong with wanting to be happy or wanting our friends to be happy. But again, if you get caught in this trap of, how can I optimize everything so that I'm not going to have a bad day and completely lose emotional flexibility, it's essentially a recipe for disaster. And so since that's where I had found myself, and knowing that that was leading to something kind of dire, okay, fine, but what can I do instead, right? And so that's really what led to the beginning of the research of the book. And that is that if you live mindfully in the moment and use your agency and autonomy, so a lot of this is rooted in self-determination theory as well. But again, it's very accessible to anyone. You don't need to know the science. You just need to know that in almost anything that you do, generally, you can change your outcome either by reframing it, by attacking it a different way, or potentially exchanging that activity for something else, to the point where you can balance your life out. I mean, obviously, we can't get rid of every agonizing activity, right? And that's not what life's about either. We know that, there aren't challenges in our life that's the same path towards low emotional flexibility. And those people tend to be unhappy as well, right? I mean, if, we call that escapism, right? The person that runs from music festival to music festival and, doesn't necessarily need to work because they have a trust fund. Those folks, again, paradoxically, aren't happy either when you look at them. So we need challenges in our life, but unfortunately, where so many of us find ourselves here in North America is that we're not enjoying ourselves at all. And so, again, the book is kind of this 1-2 punch of, one, why did we overprescribe the happiness and how that's kind of become problematic, looking at it as an outcome, and the fact that it tends to be a lagging indicator. And then this idea of time affluence, that a lot of us have essentially let go of our calendar, habituated our lives in a way that's become so routine, we're just not finding joy and tools to course correct that.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I have the next question. So in the fun habit, you talk quite a bit about creating a fun file. Can you tell us a little bit about what a fun file is and also some tips for someone who might be struggling to think of ideas to add to their fun file?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I appreciate that invitation to kind of bring it back down from an academic standpoint, because this is just a really easy, behavioral science thing that we do whenever we're trying to create better options, right? And so a fun file is really just the act of being premeditated. So many of us have these opportunities in our schedule to do interesting things, but because we haven't thought about it, right, then we don't have kind of the options to put into play. So think of the busy parent that kind of let spring break sort of pass by, where if they had thought about it or had a list of things that they could put into play, that would actually get done. And so, as simple as that sounds, when you don't do that work, oftentimes, again, time just seems to get by. So the exercise is, simply just brainstorming and, putting down what are the things that you used to like to do, what are the things that you kind of feel inspired by, if you are on something like social media or you see your friends doing and you really want to enjoy that. Your friends tend to be a good sort of reflection of who you are. So what are your friends doing that you might want to do? And if you really get stuck, I find that one of the best ways is to go to your fun friends and ask them, like, what is it that we could do, like, because how you feel when you're around them and they'd be happy to take you along because they're your friend. And so relying on them for some ideas, and then kind of future think, right? Oftentimes too, if you're sort of midlife, like, what is it that you want, as morbid as this sounds, on your obituary? Like, what do you want to be remembered for, and what are things that when you think about them, if they weren't in your life, in the final years, you would be sad. And getting all that down. And then what I do suggest, especially if you want to make immediate impact, is to shorten that list to about 8 to 15. Because what can happen, especially if you're someone that is good at brainstorming, just paradox of choice. You see this big list and you feel like you got it all out of your head, but then you're not going to take action, right? So we shorten the list a little bit and look for things that we can put right into play so we can get that taste of what it feels like to integrate fun back into our life. And what I suggest, again, another tool from behavioral science there, is the pre-commitment. If it's with a friend, invite your friend along and say, we're doing this, right? Because if you make kind of that social contract with them, it's going to get done. If you have the privilege to pre-buy something that you wanted to do, like going to a concert or seeing a comedy show, buy the ticket, because very rarely, if you purchase the thing, will you not do it. And then, one of the easiest things is just get it on your calendar. Unfortunately, so many of us have let our calendar rule our lives, especially our professional lives, but we can use that to our advantage, right? When it gets on our calendar, it generally becomes immutable, even if it's just this hour I'm reading a book because I haven't read for enjoyment for so long, right? And you're like, you know what? This 7 to 8, hour block is mine. And especially if you're in a partnership with others, letting them know, like, look, I have 168 hours in my week and I can't even say one of them's mine. Would you support me in this? Because I haven't done anything that I wanted to do for so long. And unless, there are other issues that probably should get addressed first, generally most partners are going to support you in that. And what happens is you can also, then it becomes reciprocal, right? Because through reciprocity, they might, say, oh, I'd like one of these too. And then you find out, again, we're not trying to go overboard, but you figure out how to do that, 2 or 3 times throughout the week. And now both of you are really, enjoying hours that you can say you own.
Thank you.
Great. What are some common misconceptions people have about incorporating fun into their routines?
Well, there are many, right? But I think the one that I find the most insidious, again, it seems to have a North American slant, is this idea that low arousal fun is not fun. It really makes me sad when I'm working with folks and they're like, I'm just not a fun person. And you find out it's because their idea of fun was essentially advertised to them, right? They think fun, is being at a fair or on the beach, in this sort of boisterous mood, clicking their heels, and getting a great Instagram photo. So I'm standing on the shoulder of a giant here. She's done some amazing work in this area. Her name's Dr. Jeannie Tsai out of Stanford, but she's really like dug into this idea that things like serenity and calm and peace, they're still pleasurable, right? Again, I guess one thing we haven't done is, you know, kind of a basic definition of fun is you're finding pleasure in the activities you're engaging in and you're drawn to them, right? Or things that aren't fun or things that you don't want to do and you find unpleasurable. So by that definition, right, which is the definition of fun, if you're sitting by yourself at a pool with a book, that is just as fun as a person that would derive pleasure, seeing Taylor Swift in the front row. And so, but you'll talk to so many of these folks and say, well, I'm just not a fun person. This is what I do. Right. And it's like, no, you are just as fun. And once you're able to kind of reframe that, then you start to look for things like, wow, okay, well, I just, what I've been kind of, sold as fun, that's not my jam. Maybe I'm going to try gardening, and maybe I'm going to try these things that are more in line with my preferences, because it doesn't matter what the outside world thinks of what I'm doing. What matters is that I'm enjoying the things that I'm doing and I'm drawn to them. I want to do them more. They lead to my own betterment. They lead to a connection to the thing that I'm enjoying, whether that be your partner, whether, again, something like gardening, where it's that uh, that relationship you have with helping things grow. With a book, the relationship you have with the story or the author. So it's these connections and the lead to betterment, so that we feel good about how we're spending our time. Oftentimes, if that's not in alignment, like, okay, I'm going to try and be fun, right? That's done, for extrinsic reasons, and it's not going to lead to betterment, and certainly doesn't fill our fun cup.
Mm.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I do think there's a lot of pressure on you to be a fun person, but you can be a not that fun person, but still have a lot of fun.
Well,
Like
and isn't that a shame? Because again, you almost spelt out like that's what makes me sad. No, you are a fun person. You don't have to be somebody else's definition of it, but like, yeah, and the rub is those people generally are having way more fun than the person that's doing it for this artificial currency of likes and comments on their social media, who are just kind of constantly thinking about what's the next exciting thing I can do as performance art, where the other person is living this fulfilling life where they're looking forward to the next week because they remember, and they're encoding these rich experiences that they're having because they're done by their own design rather than what is some other next high arousal thing I can do to again make people feel like I'm a fun person.
great, thank you.
Okay, I have the next one here. So, what do you think are some of the biggest factors that shape our individual ideas of fun?
So this is another great question. It's multifaceted. So I think I'll answer one of the facets that I've been finding the most fascinating. Um, it's a bit nuanced, but I've really been intrigued about how culture really can define it, especially collectivist culture and individualistic culture, because it's clear that fun is more communal for cultures that are collective, right? And so they will share, in a family dinner, and the fun is really dispersed throughout the folks that they're sharing it with. Where and again, these are generalizations, right? But in individualistic cultures, we tend to find fun in things we celebrate that are really personal achievements, right? Like I ran a marathon and I got my PR, right? Or, a Goodreads sort of challenge, and these things that we find exciting. And so that's one aspect. So a lot of it's going to be, are you sort of engaged in this collective effervescence, or is it things that, really create personal affect? And so that's one nuance. The other that we've already kind of discussed is, your arousal preference. And so I find that fascinating too. That, again, a common example that I use, I am the guy that likes loud music, right? So I tend to enjoy high arousal stuff. and my wife really enjoys low arousal stuff, but we can come together and figure out things, where those two can complement each other. And so oftentimes those differences, allow you to get creative of where you can meet in the middle. And then you celebrate each other's differences, again, by giving them the space to enjoy the things they want to, as a solo activity. So those two really seem to be kind of the crux of, the true delineation of preference. Again, do you enjoy kind of communal fun, and do you share those experiences as a communal experience, or do you really enjoy fun as sort of a mindful, internal mechanism? And then, again, to what degree do you need to feel aroused to have fun? Like, is it something invigorating? Are you an endurance athlete, or is it something, that kind of is calming and you enjoy yourself when there is no noise and no stimulation?
Thank
Right.
you.
Yeah, you see that with kids, that they are so different from each other that way, all from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So for some people, and I'll admit me, there's nothing they like better than seeing their calendar completely open. So how would you suggest for people who enjoy that to incorporate fun without it seeming like another appointment on your calendar?
That's a great question. Um, I think having those open moments, so still having a time block for the ability to be creative on how you're going to use that time, is what I'd suggest. So, you kind of have a, this openness to it, that I'm going to do the things that I enjoy and this is the time for it. But if structure kind of gets in the way of making that enjoyable, allowing that spontaneity to come in. So, on this day, I'm going to go on a hike, but it doesn't matter what time and it doesn't matter how long. Obviously, that's a luxury that a lot of folks don't have. So it's generally, not something, most of the folks that come to me and find my work are the time poor, right? So we're trying to find these spots. And as you know, in the book, one thing that I try desperately not to do is make fun homework for someone that's, already living this really busy life, so they feel like it's one more burden. But if you have the luxury of these open spaces, it's just that mandate that, like, okay, today I'm going to do what I want to do. And if that's nothing, then that's fine too, right? But what I would suggest is that if you're not moving towards something, most of the research suggests, this is coming from Dr. Cassie Holmes out of UCLA and Jordan Etkin out of Duke. They looked at folks that have windows that are larger than 5 hours a day in their schedule. And those folks, as a generality, I'm sure there's always, edge cases, but in general, after about the 5 hour mark of, having a schedule that is that open, you'll start to question whether or not you're living a purposeful life. So there is this Goldilocks spot for the quant folks in the audience. Dr. Holmes says it's about 2 to 5 hours. In fact, I imagine you have her amazing book, The Happier Hour, in your library as well. So anyone that wants access to her wisdom, she's put it in the book too.
Thank you.
Okay, so in the book, you talk about the power of reminiscing and reliving memories. How do you draw the line between creating a treasure chest of photos and mementos while also being present in the moment?
Yeah, so I think that question, they really are two different activities, right? And so certainly, one of the benefits of having fun is it is an act of mindfulness. So I would always suggest you stay in the moment for the most part when you're doing it. Um, and then, this act of reminiscing is something that you do to kind of extend fun's value, because when you don't have the opportunity to engage in the activities that you want, you can create these vessels so that you can look back at the things that you enjoyed, because we know savoring is an amazing mechanism to bring you back into those moments. But this is one of the few questions you told me that was coming my way. And one of the first things that came to mind, and it's not my idea, but I've been asked about it quite a bit. So, and again, there's no underpinning science, but I find the concept really intriguing. And this is the idea of type 1, type 2, and type 3 fun. And so for those that aren't familiar with it, it's kind of a novel concept that I believe a writer for REI sort of brought forth, but then folks have kind of latched onto it. And it's more discussed in the endurance world. So real quick, uh, type 1 fun is what we've talked about, right? It's enjoying what you're doing and you're really in the moment. But type 2 fun are the things that are, what I call in the book hard fun, where when we're in it, even though we know that it's something that we want to be doing, we're not necessarily in that positive valent state. We're not necessarily drawn to it. Like, sometimes that voice in our heads are like, why did I sign up for my 12th marathon or whatever it is, right? Folks that really like to push themselves. But the dividends of reminiscing about it afterwards, especially if you accomplish the goal, right, are at such a magnitude that this type 2 fun, where it's not fun in the moment, but again, it's so fun to think about afterwards. It can be useful. Then there's this idea of type 3 fun, which is never fun. You're doing it, you hate it, and then you look back at it and you hate it. So I tend to argue with those folks that that's not fun at all, because there's absolutely nothing fun about that construct. But I do like this idea of type 2 fun, because I do think those things are important. And oftentimes that type of fun, although again, by our definition, isn't really fun when you're doing it, are the things that can lead to growth, can lead to transcendence. And certainly things that, kind of bond you, especially if you do it as a group, right? Because these challenges can lead to those things that kind of strengthen social connection, which makes the next adventure that much more fun.
Yeah.
Do you have any examples of real life success stories from people, some of your readers who have incorporated some of your principles from the book since it was published?
Yeah, that's been really endearing, especially, seeing folks that have graciously, given feedback on the book. And then just a lot of letters that have come my way. I think reorchestrating, recalibrating has been really helpful for folks. So especially, I've been really touched by the amount of moms who just felt trapped. There's this concept that I didn't talk about in the book, but was introduced to me afterwards. This idea of the sandwich generation, right? So I have gone down that rabbit hole. It's this era that we live in where a lot of us, just because of the way the world is now, are having kids later. And this is a good thing, but it certainly is adding to our responsibilities. Our parents are living longer, right? And so in previous generations, our parents would help with that. And instead now they're not, because again, we're having kids a little bit older, but we're also having to take care of them too. And so we're some of the most time poor folks. And the ability to look at a busy schedule and re-architect it has really changed a lot of folks. One person had described how they were just in a downward spiral, and I was able to get them in a place where they were back in an upward spiral. And then just last week, one that was really nice, because what I would say, and I think this is, something commonly levied at self-help books, that there's always the criticism of privilege, because fair enough, some of the tactics I use in my own life, and I do feel, grateful for a little bit of privilege. But one person who was a teacher who just didn't have a lot of means, but really wanted to go to this conference, took the Elizabeth Taylor story to heart and was like, that is such a great idea. And sure enough, she wrote a really kind letter to this very expensive conference and indicated, I'm not in a position where I could afford it, but I would commit to serving you as much as possible as long as I could attend the sessions. And they said, absolutely. In fact, they even took care of, some of the accommodation. And so it's those little nuggets. Again, this isn't an earth-shattering book, right? But it's the folks that are able to pull the meat that's going to work for them, because there's so much information in there, right? And as long as they don't get overwhelmed, but are able to pull some of these pieces and put them into play, I've been really pleasantly surprised by the hundreds and hundreds of people that have indicated just these small shifts that really moved me towards what, I call this bias of fun, and this acknowledgement that fun is abundant in our lives, right? Which doesn't mean we have to forsake the fact that life's full of slings and arrows, but that if we do reclaim this agency and autonomy we all have, and kind of steer our ship always to the right, even though life will drag us to the more challenging side from time to time, it reminds us we have the power to push ourselves to the right so that the corpus of our experience is joyful rather than mundane.
All right, thank you.
So, what are some low-cost ways that families can work more fun into their lives?
Yeah, so I mean, this is where you really could get innovative. And I love this question because oftentimes, again, challenging this idea that it has to come from privilege, it just doesn't. So one of the things my daughter and I are doing, we'll take classes on YouTube for things that we want to do, right?
Mm.
For us right now, cooking's our jam. And so there's so many craft type things that you can engage in. And for the parents that are listening to this, it's a double win because one, now you're doing something for betterment, right? You're really enjoying it and it's free. And it doesn't have to be cooking. It could be something STEM related or whatever it is for you. Again, something outdoors, but it puts you in a place where you're not the teacher. So you can have a lot more fun being childlike with, your kids, and kind of, if anything goes wrong, villainize, this fictitious person on the screen and kind of laugh at your mistakes rather than, there's a psychological concept called transactional analysis. And when we're perceived as the teacher, right, it's a lot less, it's a lot more challenging
Mm.
for both sides to have fun because the child feels like, oh, okay, they're trying to teach me something. If I make a mistake, right, there might be a potential consequence. And again, are in this place where you're not necessarily in a playful state. You're like, you're trying to convey wisdom. And so being able to be a student with your child really pays dividends. Communities are full of just so many amazing things if you just take the time to do a Google search. We live in what I felt like a small town, but it's not, right? And our community calendar is full of just, amazing things that we can do whenever we want. And now this wasn't available when the book was out, but a tool that has been communicated to me as being helpful, and I've used it a few times, is all of these different generative AI bots that are free to use, and just putting in your preferences, right? Because we are all unique. And I would really like to do this. What are some ways that I could do this for free? And I've been amazed at the ability to generate interesting ideas from some of these AI bots that are available to all of us.
Very cool.
Those are some great ideas. Yeah. So writing is not typically considered a fun experience for most writers. And I can testify, I write book reviews, and I always say my house is never cleaner than when I have a review deadline coming up. So did you find any ways to make the process of writing the fun habit more fun?
And that's so funny about the clean house. I did find out that's more common than not, but I remember when I was trying to finish my dissertation, my wife going, "How many times are you going to move those stacks of paper from one side of the room to the other?" Because I would just kind of clean underneath them. So that's so funny. So this is a nice invitation to say that there's generally three things to play with if you're looking to try and increase the enjoyment, even if it's something that ultimately you wouldn't say is fun, but you're trying to make it more enjoyable. And that's the environment you're doing the activity in, the activity itself, and the people that you're doing it with. So to answer your question, one, because the original manuscript was very academic, I am an academic, and Simon and Schuster was, rightfully said this needs to be rewritten, and wanted me to work with a collaborator. I interviewed a collaborator that was going to make it fun. In fact, I knew it was a good match when she said if we weren't having fun, we weren't going to do this right. So her name is Sarah Gray. She was amazing, and she made sure the whole process was fun. And I guess just to her credit, doesn't necessarily answer your question, but unfortunately, I did get COVID, during the pandemic, and so succumbed to long COVID for a little bit. And so even in those really agonizing times where I didn't have the energy, knowing that I was still going to get to be with her, in the process, made it not as agonizing. And then just the environment. When I didn't want to write in my office anymore, I would go to Starbucks. And then sometimes I'd invite my daughter along so that I would kind of have this respite and just know that, it would be kind of fun because she was there. And if I had some crazy idea, I could bounce it off of her. And so she made it more enjoyable as well. And then I was really moved, like a lot of writers are, by Bird by Bird, and Lamont's book. And so I would use some of the tactics in her book to kind of, turn it into a game. In the book, I share John Cleese's wisdom about how to make these kind of, small episodic things fun. And so I would use, her, for folks that aren't familiar, she talks about if you get stuck to just write in a picture frame, make that 350 to 500 words, paint the picture because that's easy to do. And so that's what I did. I'd have fun with that particular little piece. If I got stuck, and I found that enjoyable all the time. So I really did play with those three constructs, but I hope anyone listening knows that you can play with all three of those in any situation. If you find, yourself just not really enjoying it, is it because potentially if you change up the mix of people you're doing it with, it could be more enjoyable? Is it just the environment? I talk about this in the book, and it's a big one. Sorry, I'm kind of deviating from the question, but this idea of exercise, especially now because we know exercise is so important, and we really are having these amazing conversations about health span. I'm surprised about how many people, again, because of the social normative things that are fed to us, feel like exercise has to be in the gym, and like the gym just isn't a fun place for a lot of folks. Like, hey, guess what? You can get the same benefit going on a hike in nature. Like, is that like, do you like that? Oh yeah, I love that. Okay, well then go exercise there. And just that reminder that you have the ability to, to figure out what are the elements that are going to work for you, and anything that you're trying to move the needle on. We know that when we make things more enjoyable, and again, this isn't conjecture, this is, things empirically validated, that once we get it into a fun state, we tend to stick with it more. So it's not just about increasing your enjoyment, for things where you really are trying to better yourself. It's also an amazing tool to keep going. And so to circle back to your question, I definitely want to get the book done. So figuring out how to make it as fun as possible was imperative.
I love that. Thank you.
Next question here. What do you hope the legacy of this book will be? How do you see it making a positive impact on readers' lives?
So my hope is that the way that we looked at sleep in the 90s, if you recall, when hustle culture was really prevalent, we had all sorts of folks say, to be successful, you grind out life when the kids go to bed. He's a hero of mine, and he certainly changed his tune in the book. I make it clear that I was talking about him in the 90s and not now. And that person is Gary Vaynerchuk. But for folks that were in the entrepreneurial space like myself in the 90s, he said, stop watching television, stop enjoying yourself, don't get any sleep. Like, if you want to be a winner, right, you grind it out. And now we know that is just an asinine assertion, right? Like, if you aren't paying attention to good sleep hygiene, and you're only getting 4 hours a night, eventually you're not going to be able to be productive, 2 to 3 weeks from now. And so that outcome happens a lot quicker. And even the most staunch productivity experts will tell you still need to get sleep to be productive. And so what I hope the legacy of this book is that it helps enhance what we already know, and that is that leisure is as important as sleep. In the book, I bring up, kind of a marquee piece of research about a wider concept known as the hedonic flexibility principle. And what we know is the folks that aren't enjoying themselves, aren't taking at least a little bit of time, for themselves, aren't creating transition rituals so they know when their work life ends, so that, they have the invitation to be good partners, be good friends, enjoy that connection to the things that they like. The folks that aren't enjoying themselves are succumbing to the same sort of consequences that folks succumb to when they're in a sleep deficit. They end up not being productive. They end up not being able to be creative and innovative. And ultimately, that lack of joy leads to burnout. The problem with it is that it's more insidious and it's a slower burn. So oftentimes, where you can tell, like, oh my gosh, you just haven't gotten enough sleep, the consequences of not having fun can be months or even years, right? And so we now know, because we're seeing record levels of burnout even after the pandemic. This was kind of getting illuminated. The book got sold before the pandemic, and we were still seeing record levels of burnout then. And then the pandemic was kind of used as an excuse, and it did muddle a lot of the narrative, right? Because it was a very traumatic experience for most. But those burnout rates didn't stop. And we now know there's a fairly solid line between the fact that a lot of us just aren't finding, joy in life, to the fact that we're burning out. And then the worst part of that, right, is whether you want to be a change maker, whether you want to be a, good steward to the folks that you love, your children and your partners and your parents, whether you just want to crush it at work. You need to have the wherewithal, the vigor and vitality to show up the next day to do these things. And so, again, in short, I hope that where this really moves the needle is it makes people realize that these, finding ways to enjoy yourself becomes an important part of a habitual life, in the same way that, looking at other aspects like nutrition and sleep are, with regards to, what we're now calling health span, a life of quality, not just quantity.
Yeah. Have a Fitbit tracker that tracks your fun along with your sleep. So you've already touched on this question a little bit, but just to follow up, we picked this book, and then immediately the war in Israel broke out. And with that, and with politics becoming so heated in the country, do you have advice for how people can reshape their ideas of fun during hard times? I know you have had some experience with that, you've said.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily compartmentalizing all of the negative things that are happening in life. I think it's realizing that to be able to have the resilience, the resolve to tackle these challenges face on does require enjoying at least some of the things that you do. So it's not despite the fact that, even though there is an abundance of joyful things to do, fun in your life, love in your life, there's always going to be an abundance of horrible things, right? I mean, there's always a war going on somewhere. There's certainly going to be slings and arrows that happen. There's going to be loss, because we all have parents, and ultimately we're going to have to deal with that. And so really, really bad things are going to happen. But just like you don't want to have fun all the time, not having fun at all is going to start to shrink the emotional flexibility you have to be able to make an impact if some of these things are important. So at the end of the book, I talk about the change makers that haven't prioritized at least some aspects of their life that they can enjoy. And eventually, what happens is you start to lose empathy for everything, right? Because your worldview is everything is horrible. And then you start to feel like you can't make a difference. So again, through all of these lenses, right, this idea that at least figuring out some ways to enjoy the gifts that life does have, even though there's a lot of horrible aspects of life, becomes extremely important, especially if you're somebody that does want to make a difference.
Great answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so I just have a question, and then Susan has a question, and then we'll go on to the patron Q&A. But my last question is, what are some of the most unique things you've heard people do for fun?
So that really runs the gambit. I think it's I mean, there's just been so amazing things. I almost want to celebrate, again, the gardener that does it every day, right? And the folks that are able to find something that they're so attached to that all the joy is intrinsic. Like, one of the 100 people that I interviewed that's certainly been influential in my life is Chip Connolly. And he's part of the Burning Man board. So there's that whole world of art cars, and we could go on about all the fanciful stuff, but that's as close as a Google search if you want that type of answer, right? I mean, people do some pretty weird stuff for fun. And like I said, more power to you as long as you're not harming anybody, right? I mean, I make some clear sort of safety rails, if it is at the expense of anybody else. I've kind of added to the definition of fun, and I would suggest that's not it, right? Because then it's a zero-sum game. But if you're not hurting anybody, I mean, there's some pretty unique stuff out there. But with regards to what I've been fascinated by, so my dad has this love affair with the tuba, and so he doesn't need variety. For him, each piece of music that he engages with is that novelty and variety. Yet the instrument and vehicle, instrument pun intended, I suppose, is his pathway. And so I find that really fascinating. I researched dancers for the book, as the folks that have read it know, and just this qualitative data where they talk about this love affair with their craft, and how much fun they have because of the relationship and the connection they have to it. That's really fascinating to me because I don't inherently have that. For me, novelty and spontaneity and all of that is really interwoven into what I find fun. But the fact that some folks are able to just hone in and build these loving relationships to what they find fun, I find fascinating.
Thank you.
Our last question, but if anybody would like to type anything in the Q&A, this is a good time to do that. But my last question for you is there anything that you are currently working on that you want people to know about?
I putting together a workbook because I do want to make it more accessible. I realize the book is, essentially a text, and so to make it more accessible, that's one thing that I'm working on. And then this idea, I've been really influenced by Peter Attia's work. A lot of people will be familiar with his book Outlive because I know it's doing really well. But this idea of adding fun as a component, this idea that life really should be as much about quality as it should be quantity, and the fact that fun does seem to be a component that's important, whether that's correlated with when we're engaging in pro-social behavior with friends, that's fun, that mitigates loneliness, which we know has a whole host of physiological and psychological benefits. The fact that it can be used, paired with BJ Fogg's work in this area to increase motivation so that we're actually not only engaging in the things that we're supposed to be doing, but we'll stick with them longer. So using that as a tool so that people really can not just enjoy themselves more and reap all the benefits that we've talked about, the last 45 minutes, but then use it as a useful tool to do some of the things that we're supposed to do too. So that's where my passion lies right now.
Okay, that's cool. I will definitely get my hands on that workbook.
And then we did get some Q&A in the chat. So the first one that we got was it challenging to share your personal story in the introduction of the book?
Thank you for that. Yeah, it was. And it was updated in the paperback. So I'm not sure if the reader has the hardback or the paperback, but so yeah, it was interesting to get long COVID. It ended up, because I think long COVID is still kind of a complex concept, that what it triggered was a rare autoimmune issue called Morvan syndrome. And so I think it was challenging in the sense to be authentic, but it's also been some of the letters and feedback that I've gotten, because I think, there are some folks where micro joys are the only thing accessible. And so, joy might be really just getting out, someone facing chronic fatigue syndrome, for instance, right? Micro joy for them might just be getting out into the front lawn and being able to see the sun. And so the ability to empathize with that, I really have viewed it as a gift. And what I will say is I think when you don't know, you don't know. And so even though, and again, whoever asked this, thank you for that. I think what might have happened is I would have given this book more importance than it deserved, right? Where, that it really could be kind of, almost overly medicinal. And I think what it did was humbled me again a reminder that these tools are very accessible, and oftentimes all we need is a nudge. But someone in the throes of biological treatment-resistant clinical depression, this isn't the right book, and they likely should figure out how to fix that first, and then fun will be waiting for them. And because of what I went through, we made sure that that was explicit in the book. We talked about biology, and to make sure that, again, this stuff is all very important, but if it's not accessible to you for various reasons, then that's okay. Let's fix that first, and then we'll get back to fun.
And then we did get another question here. Did you encounter any unexpected or surprising feedback after the book was published?
Yeah, I think a couple things. So one was the resistance piece, right? And I guess I just didn't, now it should be obvious, especially, as folks that have read the book in chapter 3, working with physicians, if you're of a certain ideology and that's kind of fixed, then, telling you that you're going to benefit from having more fun is kind of a hard message to sell. And so I think, the folks that went in and weren't really ready for the message, they were resistant to it. So it wasn't the book for them, right? The other that I find interesting is folks that picked it up and thought it was going to be a joyride. Certainly I kind of approached it like Malcolm Gladwell, and I think some folks thought, that it was essentially going to be, something that when they finished it, the consumption of the book was sort of the joyride, and not a manual to kind of making better choices about how you spend your time. So that was interesting context. I think if I knew that, I would have tried to make some accommodations. But on the flip side, I really was pleasantly surprised by the reception. And again, I think coming from my perspective, I thought maybe that's what where it would resonate, with dads. But unfortunately, the generalization there proved true. I think, unfortunately, as a kind of general statement, men tend to not ask for help or seek out, tools like mental health and things of that nature. But the amount of working moms that just felt underwater, and some of that was driven, by being on some amazing podcasts. Jenny, who has this 100 hours, or excuse me, 1,000 hours, where her kind of whole spiel is 1,000 hours outside. Like folks that are really trying to be mindful of making these choices because they understand that time is finite, and just having that nudge, these simple sort of really accessible tactics to integrate so that they could kind of get out of the rut. That's been really, really nice.
And then we'll do one last Q&A question here, and then we will go ahead and let you go for the night, because like you said, you had to bargain a little bit with your children. So the last one here is, have you noticed any trends in the demographics this book has reached? You mentioned moms, but anyone else?
Yeah, it's run the gambit. Moms certainly seem to be the kind of number one demographic. Then dads that are so, and again, I don't know if this is necessarily because of serendipity through marketing, but once it kind of reached that, working mom genre, I think dads with podcasts that were really trying to be deliberate about being a good dad latched on. So then that kind of was the second phase. And all of this was driven mainly by podcasters finding the book. And then HR professionals that are really trying to sort out how, given, a lot of things that you talked about, the complexities of Gen Z rightfully wanting to feel like they're connected to something, and that the things that they're doing are making an impact, but still doing it in a joyful way. And so how can we use some of these tools to create the agency and autonomy so that, particular workforces feel like they're enjoying themselves? And my message is a little bit different than some of the traditional organizational psychology, where I really suggest, bestowing that agency and autonomy back to the employees so that they can let you know what's fun, rather than engaging in forced fun. So that's kind of been the three main classes. Again, busy working moms, then busy working dads, and then leaders within organizations that are able to make a difference with regards to the employee environment.
Thank you so much, Mike. So we are going to go ahead and wrap up the Q&A. So I just wanted to remind patrons that we do have our last two programs for the Lincolnwood Reads 2024. Oh, I think we have Pauline. I think Pauline has her hand raised. Give me 1 second. Let's see. Pauline, I'm gonna open the mic so you'll be able to ask Mike your question directly. 1 sec. So it should be good to go in just a sec.
Hi, I have a question. So, what type of fun activities do you suggest doing with an elderly parent that's immobile and hard of hearing?
Yeah, I think is there the ability to co-create with her what she might want to do so that you can, because what I find is instead of trying to figure out what might work, being able to get feedback so that you could, figure out what you might both enjoy is a good place to start. I know that, hard of hearing definitely can be challenging. So anything that's sort of visual, that's game like, as long as that's something that they would enjoy as well. So that if it is, kind of cumbersome and makes it less fun, that that there needs to be verbal cues. Maybe something like, and again, I'm just spitballing, but something like sorry, where it doesn't necessarily need to be a lot of verbal cues, but you could still enjoy kind of the challenge of that game. But where I generally start with that is, again, having a conversation about what you both might enjoy doing within the confines of what is possible, because that co-creation allows you to both have buy-in. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Of course.
Okay, so we do have two programs left. So this Friday from 7 to 8, we're going to be having our after hour social. So we're going to be having a live jazz group. It's going to be kind of like a speakeasy social. We did get beer and wine donated by Bottles and Cans. So it's going to be a really fun time. You do have to register for that one. It is for Lincolnwood residents, but we did allow a Lincolnwood resident to register up to 3 people who do not have to live in Lincolnwood. So I would definitely register for that one. It's going to be a very fun time. And then the last one that we have is going to be our collage program, which Evanston Arts Center also sponsored for Lincolnwood Reads. So that one's also going to be really fun. And then I also want to remind everyone that as long as you're a Lincolnwood resident and if you tuned in for today's Q&A, you do get entered into the drawing to win one of the prizes that we have for Lincolnwood Reads. So make sure that you guys I'm gonna try and get everyone's name on here. But I do see that there are some people that like logged on with their phone number, so I'm not able to see who they are. So I would suggest definitely going in and filling out one of the little yellow slips at the library. Everything does have to be turned in by March 1st. So if you guys are planning to come to the social on Friday, you guys could kill two birds with one stone and knock out your two little tickets there. So that's all I have to say on my end. Thank you so much, Mike.
I saw one question that didn't get
Yeah,
answered, and it is an interesting question.
yeah.
Someone asked whether or not I have difficulty getting folks to do a time audit, and I do. And so it's not fun. My dad is a biochemist out of UC Davis that's trained tons of RDs. And so I remember as a young kid, all these folks trying to get folks to do nutritional journals, and like, no one just likes to do that kind of work, right? And time audits included. So what I would suggest, if you really just don't want to do that exercise, is try to find between 1 or 3 hours in your 168 where you can either replace what you're doing or manipulate the circumstances like we talked about. I just not enjoying this. that need change, either the activity or the people. And then if you don't want to start with the whole entire audit, oftentimes, with our phones now, especially if you feel like you might be overusing social media, there are things that will calculate the time that we spend on those. And a lot of times, especially for adults, I think we've kind of overemphasized, villainizing social media. Sometimes it's things like Gmail and Slack. Like, do you really need to be in email for 16 hours? And like, so just that cue can make you realize like, oh, maybe I'm doing that at night because, it sort of pacifies me, makes me feel good. But what it's doing is not allowing me to be present with the people that really do bring me joy within the house. So I find folks that don't want to go through that whole process can kind of take some of these cues. And then a really accessible exercise, again, one I borrowed from Dr. Cassie Holmes, I believe she talks about it in her book as well, is just going into your weekend thinking that it's a vacation. So if you're kind of, feeling like you are time poor, just remember that 2 days is really meant to be a respite. And oftentimes just that mental mind shift, something that I call story editing in the book, will allow you to make better choices and not necessarily, have to go through the whole process. What I will do to sell it, though, is that it's really hard for us to believe that we've habituated our behavior the way we do. But and again, this is a general statement, but for most people, 80 to 85% of the routine in any given week repeats itself over and over again. And so to find those pockets of things that it's like, every Wednesday and Thursday, I essentially don't do anything. It's something that I call in the yielding category. And I really could, that could be a space where, I integrate something that is leading to me feeling more fulfilled or a joyful experience rather than a passive experience. That's where the audit can be helpful to kind of find those blind spots. But if you don't feel like doing it, there are a lot more accessible ways. Again, what I would suggest is, just playing with a couple hours to try and change your circumstance and then check in with yourself and feel the difference. Or again, going into periods that really should be where you can spend the whole time flexing your agency and autonomy with just a different mindset. That reminder that this really is meant for leisure and not meant for kind of just getting your to-do list finished. So for whoever asked that, thanks for that, and I hope that was helpful.
Thank you so much, Mike. We have really enjoyed this opportunity to hear more about your thoughts, and it's been a wonderful opportunity. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for coming tonight. I do hope to meet some of you at the evening social on Friday. All right. I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much,
everyone.
Mike.
Yeah,
Have a
of course.
wonderful
Thanks for supporting
night.
the book. Yeah, I appreciate it, all of y'all. Thank you.
All right.
Welcome.
Thanks so
Have a
much.
wonderful
Bye-bye.
night, everyone.